We have a special guest with us today, a man with great experiences and interesting stories. Jim Korkis, Disney historian and author of The Vault of Walt. Thanks for joining us today, Jim. How has your stay in Storm Lake been?
Oh, well, thank you for asking me, Bree. I've just had an absolutely wonderful time. So I'm glad I have an opportunity to tell people how much I've enjoyed the hospitality. And it's just like a little piece of paradise put in the middle of Iowa. This is my first time to Iowa, and I'm learning an awful lot.
You see cornfields, great. You're probably like, oh, this is an awesome place. And you've been shown around town, right?
Well, see, again, I grew up in Glendale, California, and then moved to Orlando, Florida, and so I didn't get a chance to see any of this stuff except in picture books or in paintings or whatever. And it's much more beautiful and fascinating in person than it is, anywhere else. I think a lot of people should come to Iowa. There's a lot of things here for them to do. The Meredith Willson Museum, the Bill Baird Museum, and all that. And again, I've got to say, very, very friendly and hospitable people. And I've seen that at the university.
Great. We love having you here. But we want to know about your background. Like, tell us about yourself. Set us up.
Oh my gosh. Well, thanks for asking. I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, moved out to Glendale, California when I was about 5 years old. And Glendale, California is a small town. It's right next to Burbank, which is where the Disney studios are. So between the ages of 10 and 12, I was a big fan of Disney animation. And I would watch the cartoons and I would write down the names on the credits. And then I would go to the Glendale Burbank phone book and I would phone them up, how did you make that move? And fortunately, my parents were very supportive. And at first, many of these people thought, well, this is a joke. This is a kid and he's making a joke. But when they realized that I was actually interested and passionate about this, they would invite me over. So I would go over to these houses of animators and Imagineers, and they would talk and they would teach me how to draw and tell stories. And so in junior high, I would write these down and submit them to the school newspaper, and it was picked up by the local newspaper, and then I was submitting to magazines, and before I knew it, I was a writer and I was a Disney historian. So it was a great deal of fun. But again, there were a lot of different career pathways in California before I became the Disney historian that I am today.
Mm-hmm. Weren't you ever scared to just call someone up? I don't think I would be able to call someone up and ask them about their job, especially I'd be nervous they were in the credits of a movie.
Well, and that's interesting you say that, because I don't remember I'm more nervous now talking to you than I was talking to them, because as a kid it was like, I need to know this information, and they didn't have the vast variety of books and resources. And yes, I'm old enough that there was no internet in those days. So, but these were the people who had the information. So you go to the people who had the information. I think one of the things that helped is a couple of the first people that I talked to were so kind and so supportive that it just didn't occur to me that, oh my gosh, it would be wrong to do this. I was appropriate. I called during an appropriate time. I didn't call like at midnight or at 8 o'clock in the morning. But that's a great question. But no, I had no fear at that time.
And you've been through, you sent me some stuff, and you've been all over the board as far as careers, even in Disney World. Can you explain some of those to us?
Oh, yes. All of that was to impress women, and when they weren't impressed, I'd go on to a different career. So I was a writer, but I was also a performer, and earned a nice living as a performer. I was on the Gong Show with my two brothers as singing, dancing hunchbacks, the Quasimodo Bel-Airs. Quasimodo, do you know who's going to win the third race? No, but I got a hunch. And I was on The Dating Game with my two brothers. So they had a stunt woman from Universal Studios Hollywood who was trying to find a date, and the three of us were just goofing around over that. So when we watch the tape now, we can see her eyes go, what have I gotten myself into? This is terrible. And on the Family Feud, I was on a game show where I actually won a Cadillac because I was able to answer the question, do fish get seasick?
Do they?
Yes, they do. And fortunately, I had read that right before I showed up at the game show. So for them to do that, that was amazing. So my brothers and I grew up doing an awful lot of entertaining. When I graduated college, and I'm sure none of the college audience can relate to this, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be rich and famous and have cheerleaders throwing themselves at me, but those listings weren't in the classifieds. So fortunately, I had a backup of a teaching degree, and so I went into teaching. So I taught junior high school for several years, which was a real eye-opening experience. But fortunately, a teacher's schedule gives you plenty of freedom. So in the evenings and during vacations and on the weekends, I'd still do entertaining, I'd still do writing, and I learned magic. And performed that at Six Flags Magic Mountain, and also several different venues, the Variety Arts Theater, which is a very prestigious old theater in Hollywood, and all of that. But I also did some cartooning. I was a cartoonist for 2 local newspapers. And people go, oh my gosh, this guy must be 90 years old. Look at all these things. But I was doing all of these things concurrently. So I was writing and all of that. And people always ask, well, which do you prefer doing? And I always prefer doing whatever it is I'm not doing at the moment. If
Always, of course.
Always, of course, you're absolutely right. When I'm writing, it's like, oh, this is so lonely. I wish I was involved with people. And then I do entertaining, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so scared. Why did I decide to do this? I've got butterflies in my stomach. I wish I was teaching. That's safer. And then I do teaching, and I go, nobody's listening to me. Nobody's paying attention. I'm going to go back to writing. I've got control, all of that. So yes, all over the map. But I think all of that experience adds to what you're eventually going to do. And Walt Disney, it was the same thing. When he was 19 years old, he had 6 different jobs in 1 year, and he was fired from all of them. But all of that experience he got at those jobs paid off later in life. One of those jobs was loading people onto the elevated train in Chicago, and so he had to configure people so it was easy to get the most people on and the most people quickly on to the elevated train. And so he's going, I want to be a cartoonist. Why do I need to know how to control crowds and how they would operate, in a line and all that? Well, paid off when Disneyland opened. And
you worked in Disneyland with a couple different things. Well, more than a couple, actually. You were a performer, and you did some, I remember reading some stuff about Magic Kingdom, like random points and stuff that were very interesting. What were those like? What else did you do there?
Well, actually, it wasn't Disneyland. It was Walt Disney World.
Sorry, Walt Disney World.
That's fine. People confuse it all the time. And in fact, the big joke in California was I was the most Disney person they knew, and I was not working for Disney. I did not officially work for Disney until about 15 years ago. I went out to Florida to take care of my family, my mom and dad, because they had some health problems. I figured I could always get another job, but not another mom and dad. So I started out at Pleasure Island, which is at downtown Disney, and it's a nightclub area and restaurants and shopping. And what I was doing was magic and balloon animals for drunk college students. So they would come up and they would go, make me a balloon hat with 50 balloons. And then they would throw up on my feet. But as a Disney cast member, you just smile. Oh, thank you. Don't worry about that. We'll take care of that. I did that for about 3 months, and then they moved me over to the Magic Kingdom, where I was Merlin the Magician, looking for the new temporary royal ruler of Fantasyland. Oh, yes. And on the weekends, Rush Picture Pet and Frontierland, an old gold miner. My golly. And those were called face characters because you could actually see their face. When you have a Mickey or a Minnie or a Baloo, those are called fur. And so that was very exciting. And during that time, the Disney Institute opened, and that was offering specialized classes for people who wanted to come to Disney. So classes on animation, classes on how Disney does horticulture. And so I applied, and because of my background in animation and with cartooning, I got a job as an animation instructor at the Disney Institute, and I taught classical animation and computer animation, stop motion clay animation. I taught a class called Voices of Disney, where I taught people how to do different voices, and we would record them and play that back. The Disney Institute was always undergoing changes, and so during one of those changes, I moved over to Disney Adult Discoveries, which was writing and facilitating backstage tours for guests and for convention groups. And then eventually I moved over to Epcot, where I was a coordinator with college and international program students, because in order for them to maintain their visa or to get college credit, they had to take a certain number of classes, so they thought this was important. And then I moved into the Disney Learning Center, which was sort of a computer lab, and assisting cast members there with how to use the computer, and also doing presentations on Disney history. I developed 300 different presentations on Disney history. And I will tell you that all of the ones that I'm doing for Storm Lake are brand new. They are different than the 300 that I developed for that. And although that seems like, oh my gosh, he jumped around all over these places, that's actually a very routine career at Disney. Is they are constantly moving you around into different areas so that you get a wider perspective of the company there.
And how many voices do you think you can do?
Many? Well, gosh.
How many did you have to teach?
How many did I have to teach? Well, what I taught was voice placements. There are 10 voice placements. The hero voice and the nasal voice and all of this. And then when you combine all of those different together, you can get all sorts of different voices. You know, you can get Mickey. Oh, gosh. Gee, Bree, thanks for interviewing me. And Goofy, oh, gosh, thanks. This has been a lot of fun. I'm coming back to Iowa. Donald Duck. You can go through that. I also did a lot of voiceover work for Disney. I was the off-camera narrator for a TV series called Secrets of the Animal Kingdom, where I was the off-camera narrator in the voice of a dozen different animals, and did narration for a lot of Disney videos. So, but you know, that's of all the times I've been interviewed, and I've been interviewed an awful lot, you are the first person, the first interviewer to go, well, how many voices do you think you can do? And you know what? I don't have an answer because I never sat down and
kept track of them
kept track of them all. I just know there are other voice artists who have much wider range, but my gosh, I've got to think.
Just out of curiosity.
I'll give you a phone call from Florida. Oh, by the way, the answer to that is...
Perfect. So, how do you become, you are a Disney historian.
Yes, I am.
And how do you get to there?
Oh, well, you know, you climb
Mount
like Everest and you know, they blindfold you and dip you in. Actually, Disney historian Leonard Maltin was a writer about old movies, classic movies, and all of that. And so he would identify himself as an old movie writer, and everybody thought, oh, well, you must write the screenplays for the movies. No, I write about the movies. And so Leonard came up with the term film historian. And Leonard's written a lot of great books, including the Disney films. And Leonard is a friend that I met in California. And so I was starting to write about animation, and I was described as an animation writer. Oh, what shows do you write? Well, I actually supplied some scripts for the Smurfs, but I was not an animation writer, so I became an animation historian. And then when it focused on Disney, I became a Disney historian. And today, there are a lot of people who are identified as Disney historians, and the requirement is that you do a lot of original research, that you are published, and that you are recognized by other Disney historians as this is a reputable source. And oftentimes, I'm a little different than most Disney historians, because most Disney historians have a narrow focus. They're only interested in Disney during World War II, or they're only interested in the theme parks, or they're only interested in Disneyland. I have a broad interest in all of that: Disney music, Disney history, and in fact, what I'm doing here in Iowa is I'm connecting business aspects with Disney. So I know a lot about a lot of different things, but sometimes I don't have the depth of knowledge in a particular topic that some of these others do.
But you've done a lot of research. A lot of research. I can't even begin to imagine. And
well, it actually was quite easy because I had no girlfriend and no life. And so when you don't have that, you go out and do something else. My brother actually said he hopes that I never get another girlfriend. And I said, why is that? He says, because when you get a girlfriend, all of this knowledge you have just dribbles out your ears and you're of no use to me whatsoever. But I had a lot of time, and again, it was fun. And you should do things that you're passionate about, because you will spend more time at work than you will with your family. That's statistically true. So you better find what you enjoy doing, because life really is very, very short.
Well, your latest book, The Vault, you've published other books.
Yes,
correct?
Actually, I've written several. This is the first book that I've written all by my lonesome. I had a writing partner, John Cawley, who was one of the producers of the original Garfield TV series. And so we wrote several books about animation: Cartoon Confidential, How to Create Animation, the Encyclopedia of Cartoon Superstars, that were well received. We're still friends, but we were going on different pathways and all of that. And I was spending a lot of time taking care of Mom and Dad, so I didn't have a lot of time writing. Once they passed away, worked on this book, The Vault of Walt. 400 pages, almost 40 different stories about Walt and the theme parks and animation and film, and miscellaneous stories like how the FBI was investigating Walt over the Mickey Mouse Club. And the point was to try and write stories that didn't exist elsewhere in Disney books. Sometimes in Disney books, Walt Disney's life was so rich, sometimes they could only mention a sentence. And so these are the stories that come between those sentences that people didn't have room or time or knowledge to write. Diane Disney Miller, who is Walt's surviving daughter and wrote the introduction to the book, I was very, very flattered. She said, "You've written things about my father that I never knew." She said, "I grew up with him and all of that, and I'm supposed to be the authority on my father. You know things about my father I had never heard before in my entire life. Thank you."
And you have so many stories, like you said. How did you find those things out? What were the hardest stories, the most intriguing stories to write about?
And again, it's tough to write about Disney because there's an awful lot of urban legends about Disney. And people repeat these things as if they're true. Oh, well, Walt Disney is frozen. No, he is not frozen. Walt was actually cremated, and there's documentation. I found documentation for that. But a lot of people think he was frozen because the family just had a very private funeral. So there were only 6, 7 people there. So nobody saw Walt in the hospital because Walt didn't want people to see him in the hospital. Nobody saw him lying in state. So it's like, oh, well, he's still around. He's frozen. So the tough thing about doing writing about Disney history is finding the information. So I'd have to go back to original sources. So I would dig out newspaper articles. I would interview people who were there at the time. And again, even when you're interviewing people, you better be careful because they may have their own agenda to make themselves look better than they are, or they may have a faulty memory because brain cells are dying. And here I'm asking them, well, what happened 40 years ago? And if they asked me what I had for lunch yesterday, I don't know if I could even answer that question. So you do a lot of that research, you do a lot of checking. All of the stories in the book, every individual fact, I made sure that I had at least 3 separate sources that would confirm that. Because an awful lot of times people say things and you just accept it as true because somebody says it with such authority. It was like, I've got to write this for 2 reasons. First off, all those interviews that I did, Some of those people are long gone now. This is the only chance for their voice to be heard, their story to be heard. But also for future researchers, get this material because it's disappearing.
Right.
It doesn't exist anymore.
And you checked your facts, so you have everything for the future. I mean, there are probably more stories that we still don't, you couldn't publish because you didn't have enough background information on
You
them?
are absolutely correct with that. You are absolutely, how sharp you are. Yes, absolutely correct. I had some stories about the making of Song of the South, and they were absolutely, but I couldn't confirm them. Fortunately, I have since been able to confirm them, so if I do a second book, a sequel, I'll be able to include that. I am very proud of the fact that the book came out last October, so it's been about almost a year now, and in that time, nobody has mentioned any factual error in the book. And that's tough too, because when you write, it gets out of your hand. It goes to the publisher. It goes, and so typos appear and things like this. And oh my gosh, I read that book so many times that I started to dislike that book because do I have to read this again just to make sure there were no typos, all of that was as correct as it could be.
And how long did all of this take? How long did it take
well,
you
what
to
time
write
is it now?
the
Oh,
Vault
I
of
tell
Walt?
people it took me 30 years to write the book because that encompasses all the research and the planning and all that happened. But the actual physical writing of the book, because I had all of that information, was about a year. And so I was doing other things doing that year as well, doing presentations. I did some more performing. I did some other freelance writing. But because again, you need to go away and refresh yourself. You can't concentrate on, all work and no play makes Jim a dull boy. So, but it took a year to get that done.
Mm-hmm. It goes back to like the, you said you like whichever job you're not doing currently.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. And it's still true. We're doing this, but I will say one thing. We're doing this interview, and I can't imagine anywhere else I would like to be right now than doing this interview. I can't imagine. Yes, it would be better to be sleeping, on the bed in the suite. It would be better to go to Malarkey's, and which I understand have great hamburgers, and that's why people go to Malarkey's is because of the great hamburgers.
Of course.
But I can't think of any place I would rather be at this moment than right here and answering these questions, because as an interviewer, you've done a tremendous amount of homework. You would be surprised. Some interviewers, it's like, do you even know who I am? Do you even know that I wrote a book? In fact, didn't you spend the summer reading my book?
I did. I took the book everywhere with me. It's kind of been up, so don't be mad at me. But I took it everywhere, and I read all the stories. Some of my favorite stories I started off with, I would just flip the book open and start reading wherever my finger landed, pretty much. And my favorite story was, I didn't know about all the figurines.
Oh.
That was probably my favorite story out of all of them.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed the book, and that's why the book was written. When you say a 400-page book, it's like 400 pages. When am I going to have time? So that's why I divided it up into separate stories. They run about 8 to 10 pages each, so it's great to read on an airplane or when you're standing in line and whatever. And other people have told me that too. They said, well, I bought the book because I was just interested in these stories, and they read those stories first, and then they went and read all the other stories because they had fun with that. And no, that's fine that the book is bent up. You know that the book it's so thick, you can use it as a doorstop. You can use it to stop a zombie attack. If you throw it, hard enough, it should disable a zombie, especially if he stops to read it. But and so in the second book, I'll make sure to put in zombie stories, so we can do that. Yes, okay. Absolutely.
One of the stories is also kind of starts back at the beginning in Marceline, Missouri.
Yes, which is nearby to here. I understand it's nearby to
close is it?
Iowa. Well, it must be pretty close because they have an event called TuneFest, and they said, "Oh, well, you're in Iowa. You could just drive to to Marceline." And I thought, is that one of those drives where you get on the car and you just drive forever and ever and ever and ever, and then forever and ever and ever and ever and ever?
And then maybe you'll get there.
Maybe, okay. So I don't know much about Midwest geography, but what about Marceline, Missouri would you like to know?
Where everything started, where Walt started, and a little bit about Roy, because surprisingly enough, I had to do my research to find out about Roy, because even I didn't know about him. He's not out there as much as it's always Walt Disney, Walt Disney.
And Walt and Roy were both a wonderful team together. But yes, Roy purposely wanted to avoid the spotlight so his younger brother could take focus. Yes, the Disney family, Elias and Flora Disney, had 5 children. They had a farm on Marceline, and that they were working. They had 4 sons, Herbert, Raymond, Roy, Walt, and then a little sister, Ruth. And there was quite a gap between the first 3 and the last 2. Herbert went on to be a mailman. And actually, he went on to be a mailman in Glendale, California. So my first grade teacher at Thomas Edison Elementary School in Glendale, California was Margaret Disney, who was Herbert's second wife. And she was a younger wife, but she was teaching first grade. And what I did is I went and I grabbed a sheet of easel paper and I drew a picture of Jiminy Cricket, because that was my favorite character at the time, because Jiminy and Jimmy, that was close enough. And so I drew a picture of Jiminy Cricket and gave it to her in the hopes she would take it to the Disney studio and I would be hired immediately so I wouldn't have to learn my multiplication tables in the 3rd grade. But Portfolio Review was backed up for decades, apparently, before I got a job at Disney. And yes, I had to do multiplication, but I still don't know those tables today. The second brother was Raymond, and he was an insurance salesman. And if people want to know what Raymond actually looked like, he was the basis for the character Honest John in Pinocchio, with the cigar, and he was a flim-flam artist, and he was as an insurance salesman. And then there was Roy Disney, who was very quiet, very studious, very disciplined, very responsible. And there was an 8-year gap between Roy and Walt, so they developed a real closeness, an older brother and a younger brother. And then Ruth was just the little tag-along sister that you tease and you get into trouble and all of that. And so Walt and Roy were the ones who primarily worked on the farm, because the 2 older brothers felt the work was just, too hard. They didn't like being told what to do, and so they ran away from home, found other jobs. And so Elias was stuck running this huge farm with these 2 young boys. And then Elias got sick, so they needed to move because they couldn't maintain the farm, and they moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and where Walt went to school and Roy went to school, and both of them worked a newspaper route. And around that time was World War I, and Roy was old enough that he signed up for the Navy. And Walt saw him in that uniform and just fell in love with that because he looked so patriotic and all that. And so Walt tried to sign up, but Walt was too young. Walt was only 16 years old, so they wouldn't accept him. And so what Walt did was he forged his birth certificate. He got his birth certificate. He was born in 1901, and it still exists. And you see where he took a pen and changed the 1 into a 0, so it's 1900. So he was 17 years old, according to that. And he got a job as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross over in France. And so he shipped out there and actually celebrated his 17th birthday in France. And then when he came back, his father wanted him to go into the jelly factory business and all that, and Walt didn't want to do that. He was now 19 years old, and by golly, he's a man. And of course, many of the 19-year-olds who are listening to this know that feeling. You know, I'm 19 years old, I know what I'm doing. I wish those old people would just die and get out of the way and let me take over the world now. And so he started his own animation company called Laugh-O-Grams. And actually, they're pretty good. They've all survived today, which is interesting because 90% of all films made before 1940 no longer exist in any form whatsoever because they were done on nitrate, so very combustible, so they were destroyed. But all of those laughograms from 1919, 1920 still exist. But what was happening, he was not a good businessman, so he signed a very bad contract that he wouldn't get paid until 6 months after the films were delivered, and he charged the price of what it cost him to make the film, no overhead to cover staff or invest in another, and so by the age of 20 he was bankrupt. And so his advice to 19 and 20-year-olds is it's good to have a strong failure when you're young, because you learn that you can survive it and you can get up and you can walk away. And it's also good to have a failure when you're young because people will look at you and go, oh, they're young. They'll learn.
Whew, that makes me feel better.
That's it, yeah. See, in the position I'm in, they go, he's old enough to know better. Why did he do that? So it's like, no, I'm not. What are you doing? So Walt decided to go to California. His brother Roy was in a veterans hospital because Roy had picked up tuberculosis. And so in those days, they shipped folks to a drier climate so that it would dry out the lungs and all that. And Walt walked into the hospital and he said, I'm going to start an animation company. You need to sign yourself out of here. And sure enough,
we're going.
We're doing it. We're doing it. And so Roy signed himself out and walked out of the hospital the next day. And Walt and Roy lived together for a period of time. It was really an odd couple relationship. Walt was very messy. Roy was very neat. And they started the Disney Brothers Studios. And what is interesting about that is after the first couple of years, it was Roy who said, let's call it the Walt Disney Studio.
Giving Walt credit.
Absolutely, because there were other brother studios. There were the Warner Brothers and all of that. Mm-hmm. And so they started doing an animation series called the Alice Comedies, where they had this little 6-year-old girl, Virginia Davis, who I interviewed. She just passed away a year or two ago. And they had her in a cartoon background. So she was interacting with all these cartoon characters and having adventures in the Wild West and Under the Sea and the whole bit. Very, very popular. Dozens of those films made. And so popular that it started another series called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And a lot of people don't know this, but thanks to the people listening to this interview, they'll know that. Why he was a lucky rabbit, it's because he had 4 lucky rabbit's feet. That's why he was a lucky rabbit, because he had a lucky rabbit's foot on each foot. And what happened is, again, Walt didn't look closely enough at the contract, so Charles Mintz, who was distributing the films, copyrighted the character in his name, copyrighted the films in his name, and so when Walt went to ask for more money because he wanted to experiment, by golly, Charles Mintz said, not only do I own the character in the films, but I knew you were coming out to ask for more money, so I sent my brother, who's a lawyer, on the train that passed yours, and he's hired every one of your artists. I offered them a higher salary than what you were paying, so every one of your artists except Ub Iwerks is now working for me. And so then what happened is on the train trip back from New York, Walt came up with the idea of Mortimer Mouse.
I was just going to ask.
Mortimer Mouse. And his wife Lillian, who is with him, said, Mortimer? That's a terrible name for a mouse. You know, make it something shorter. Make it something more friendly. So it was Mickey Mouse. So when he got off the train in Hollywood, he had a new character, and he only had one animator, Ub Iwerks. And it's 24 drawings for each second of film. A good animator at Disney could turn out maybe 10 or 20 usable drawings per day. Ub Iwerks was the type of artist who could turn out 200 drawings a day.
Oh my goodness.
He would sit down and he would start with the first drawing and then go to the second and the third and the fourth and fifth. There was no in-betweening. He did all of that. And so Ub did the first Mickey Mouse cartoon, and everybody thinks that that's Steamboat Willie, but it wasn't. It was Plain Crazy. where Mickey and Minnie are in a plane, and Mickey is trying to get a kiss from Minnie. That's why he's taking her up in the plane, so she has to kiss him, or else, you know, my gosh, where are you going to go? Well, she doesn't put up with that. She slaps him and jumps out of the plane and uses her underwear as a parachute to get back down. And then they made another film called Galloping Gaucho, which was a parody of a Douglas Fairbanks silent film. But people took a look at this and they said, why should we take these cartoons? There's nothing different in it than any other cartoons that are out there. So the third cartoon that was made was Steamboat Willie. And it had synchronized sound, which meant that the sound related to what was happening on the screen. So if the steamboat whistle opened, you heard the steamboat whistle sound. And sound was also used for a comedy device. So when Mickey opened the mouth of a cow and hit each of the teeth, it sounded like a xylophone. Now, those of you who grew up in Iowa know that that doesn't happen with real cows, but it got a big laugh, and it was the first cartoon with synchronized sound, and it was a huge hit. And so when Walt said it all started with a mouse, it really was. That was truly the beginning of the Disney studio and the Disney company and all of the animation. And good old Mickey, he's been around since 1928.
Wow, 1928.
Now you weren't around then, right? Not a gleam in your parents' eyes.
Nope, I don't believe so.
Okay.
So we have Mickey Mouse, Walt and his wife Lillian, correct?
Roy and his wife Edna.
Right. Walt and Lillian had Diane and Sharon.
Correct?
Right.
Now
what influence did they have?
Okay, and one of the things too is they had Diane, and that was 1933, and it was a difficult birth, and basically the doctor said, you really shouldn't try another pregnancy. And so they adopted a child, Sharon. But even though they told Sharon she was adopted, you didn't publicize it in those days.
Right.
That was not considered appropriate. And the children had a huge influence, because Walt would bring home the cartoons from the studio to show them, and they would go, "Oh, that's boring." So
we don't like that.
So he had to come up with other things to do. But Saturday was always Daddy's day with the kids, and so to bond with his daughters, he would take them out, and he would take them out to circuses and little parks and a carousel out at Griffith Park. And but one of the things Walt noticed as he was sitting there on the bench and they were riding the carousel, and Walt had actually bribed the person on the carousel so that Sharon and Diane would always get the brass ring when they reached out to grab it from the horse. Walt thought, you know, there should be a place where a father, a parent, and his kids could have fun together. And that didn't exist, because there were amusement parks, but amusement parks were designed to separate people. The roller coasters, that's where the young people went. There were little itty-bitty kiddie rides that were only big enough for a child, to be in. And oftentimes the parents would just sit on the bench eating popcorn,
and
waiting
watch.
for somebody to run by and say, give us some more money to do this. And it is from that experience that Walt decided, let me come up with a place where families have at least the opportunity to enjoy it together. And that's where Disneyland came from. And in fact, if you take a look at the early Disneyland rides, Walt didn't have a roller coaster or a Ferris wheel. And people said, well, you're crazy. That's what you have to have. That's what people want.
That separates.
And Walt said, yes, I want something that everybody can ride together. And so he got one of the Imagineers, Bruce Bushman, who was about 6'5", 6'7", and he was like 300 pounds, and he had him sit in the prototype vehicles because he said, if Bruce can sit in that comfortably, then there's enough room for an adult and a kid to sit in there. And so that's how that measurement was done. But the opening of Disneyland, July 17th, 1955.
I read it was awful.
Not a success, because Walt was planning for 15,000 people, and he had them separated throughout the park because they were doing a live camera feed. ABC was doing it. It was the largest remote ever in the history of the world, like 26 cameras all over the place. And so Walt wanted people spread all throughout the park, because how terrible would that be if the camera went to the Snow White ride and nobody's standing there? Well, he was expecting 15,000. 33,000 showed up. Some with counterfeit tickets. Some brought ladders and put them on the fences in the back and climbed over. One enterprising young boy had a wire cutter and he cut a hole in the fence and was charging people a nickel to go in. There were people who were showing up at the gate and they go, "We've been watching the Disneyland TV show for a year and Walt keeps saying, come on down and visit us in Disneyland. Walt wants us in there now." So it was terrible. The asphalt had just been laid on Main Street the night before, so women's shoes got stuck in the asphalt, so they had to pull out their feet and leave their shoes stuck in the asphalt. Ride capacity, they knew nothing about ride capacity, so they put as many people on the Mark Twain as wanted to go. So the first trip around the rivers of America, half of it was underwater. People would rush to one side of the boat to see Tom Sawyer's Island, but nothing was built there till 1956. And then some person would shout out, "I see a bird over," and so everybody rushed to the other side of the boat, so it's rocking back and forth. There was a gas leak in Fantasyland. And so reporters gathered around the front of the castle, and some had little step ladders and all that, because they were hoping there was going to be a big explosion and the castle would go sailing up in the air like a rocket ship. At the carousel, there were people, because Walt hadn't established queue lines, standing around the carousel trying to throw their children onto the horses, because that's what you would do at an amusement park. You had to get there before someone else. At Autopia, some of the parents thought they were waiting in line too long, so they'd hop over the fence, pull a kid out of the car, and put their kid in the car to go around. And the cars didn't have governors. So as the cars started to pull into the disembark area, kids would press their foot down on the accelerator to speed up, and they'd speed up to 15, 20 miles an hour and try and knock over cast members. It was called Blood Alley. They ran out of food.
Scary place.
Yes, they ran out of food halfway through the day because there were too many people. And so imagine working in a restaurant and people are coming and waving cash in your face and you have no food. They didn't know what to do with the garbage, so they just tossed it out behind the buildings. So later that afternoon in the California heat, that odor just wafted onto Main Street. You know, it was like, holy cow. They didn't know that every attraction had a separate ticket, you know, so you had to pay change for that. They didn't realize how much change they were going to be taking in. There was so much change, they didn't have time to count it. They had to put it in buckets and run it to the front of the park and weigh it and then take it to the bank, because banks would close before 5 o'clock, so you had to get it to the bank. In fact, in the early days, those people who were salaried cast members said, oftentimes we would get a paycheck and they would tell us, "You need to hold on to that for 3 or 4 days before you cash it because we're not sure we're going to have enough money in the bank." Huge disaster. And there was a plumber's strike, so Walt had to choose between either getting the bathrooms working or the water fountain, so he chose the bathrooms. And so the next day in the LA Times was a huge headline, "Cash Register Disney, only wants money. He doesn't have water fountains. He's forcing people to buy Coke and Pepsi," both of which were sold in the park because they were different, and Walt felt that guests should have that chance. Terrible. So how did this turn around? Well, Walt insisted that his management go to Disneyland at least twice a month, park where the guests park, stand in line where the guests stand in line, eat what the guests eat, and if they were unhappy with any part of that experience, that needed to be fixed. And so Walt was sitting out by the Mark Twain one time and next to an old lady, and he goes, "Well, how do you like, the park?" And she goes, "Oh, the park's fine, but we don't care for the rides. But my husband loves the Mark Twain, and I can't get him off the train, but boy, we don't care for rides." Because rides was associated with an amusement park, so they became attractions. And Walt then established a training program so everybody who worked at Disney learned to be aggressively friendly. And aggressively friendly is, if you come into the park and I'm standing there, I'm smiling and I'm just standing there. But aggressively friendly is, I see you fiddling around with that map. I come up and I go, "I'm sorry, I don't mean to intrude, but can I help you find something? Can I make some suggestions?" Friendly is, "Oh, look at those people taking a picture. That's nice." Aggressively friendly is going up and going, "Would you like to be in that picture? I can take that. Show me what button to push here." And within 6 months, the entire thing was turned around. Million guests already welcome to the park. All of that other stuff forgotten. All of those bugs worked out.
And that leads me to think about, we've talked everything has a story.
Yes.
Everything in his parks have a story. How does he get that? Where does that come from? Who thinks of that?
Where do the stories come from?
Yes.
And in fact, there's a phrase that is used at Disney. It's called everything speaks. And that refers to the fact that there's a story behind the food and beverage location, and behind every attraction, and behind every merchandise area, all of that. And again, that brings us back to a theme park. And a lot of times people associate theme with story. And for Walt, his wife said, "Why are you building that? Nobody likes amusement parks. They're dirty, they're unsafe." And he says, "Mine is going to be different." And he based it on entertainment. You know, a lot of people don't realize, why did he pick Tomorrowland, Frontierland, Adventureland, Fantasyland? There's all sorts of things he could have picked, you know, the Land of Oz, Under the Sea, you know, whatever. He picked the lands that he picked because those were the primary film genres of the 1950s. Tomorrowland, that's the first time science fiction films were coming out, and there was all that UFO interest. Frontierland, Westerns very popular in the movies and on TV. There were 26 hours of original Westerns on TV each week. Adventureland, not only did it relate to the true life adventure films that Walt was making, but the Tarzan movies were still popular. And on TV you had Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, and Rama of the Jungle with John Hall and all of that. And Fantasyland, cartoons. So immediately when you come in to the Disney theme park, you realized you were in a film experience. And the people who were building the facades on Main Street and in all of the lands, they were film designers. Emil Curry, Ken Anderson, Bill Martin, all of these people had experience designing sets for films at 20th Century Fox and MGM and all of that, and they were now working for Disney. So you were getting a film experience, which was something that you didn't get at an amusement park, and you had a centralized hub where everything spoked out from that. So there was a sense of reassurance and safety and I know where I am type thing. Whereas in an amusement park, it's chaotic and it's noisy and you can lose your way and you don't know which way you're going. So to help support that story, everything needs to do that. And for instance, we'll use the example of Main Street, USA. All 5 of your senses are being manipulated. When you stand on Main Street, USA, you're hearing turn-of-the-century music. You're seeing buildings that are from the turn of the century. You're seeing cast members in turn-of-the-century costumes. You're smelling bakery, fresh baked goods, which you'd smell at the turn of the century. You can buy it to eat. You're feeling the railing, and it's wrought iron. You know, it's not fiberglass, it's real. So all 5 of your senses are telling you you're in turn-of-the-century America between 1890 and 1910. And Walt picked that time period specifically because if you went before 1900, you'd just have to have horses and buggies and gas lighting. If you went after 1900, you'd have primarily Model Ts and electricity. But by putting it in that transition period, Walt was able to have both in his park, and that helped add to the story.
Gosh, this is so deep, it's getting me confused a little bit. Everything has a story, and each, I have to get all my terminology, my Disney terminology right now.
Well, and again, that's that power of words that Disney has. So it's not a customer, it's a guest.
A guest.
Because you
and a
treat,
cast member.
Yes, because you treat a guest differently than you would a customer. And yes, it's an entertainment business, so you're not an employee, you're a cast member. And you're not doing a job, you're in a role. And you
have experience with that.
Yes, and you're not wearing a uniform, you're in a costume. And when you're out there serving the public, you're on stage, and then when you go back to the break room, you're backstage or off stage. And so all of that helped reinforce that concept of this is an entertainment experience.
And what was that like? You Prospector Pat and Merlin.
Yes.
What is the life of a Disney cast member like?
You have to realize that Disney is show business. So it's not just the show aspects, it is a business. So there are some business requirements that you have to follow as well. So it isn't that you just show up and Tinkerbell flies around your shoulder. You have to learn about sexual harassment and bloodborne pathogens and responsible vendor and all of these other things too to make the magic seamless. But I will tell you, being on stage is the most amazing experience because you see people who are tremendously happy. They may have had problems at home. They may have had a sick relative. They may have had problems with finances. They may have had their car break down. They may be worried about a son or a daughter who is serving overseas, whatever. But as soon as they step foot into Disneyland or the Magic Kingdom, all of that is, I guess the best way to explain it is Roy Disney once said, everybody who comes to Disneyland is 10 years old. You know, and it's the only place in the world where parents can recapture that childlikeness, not childishness, because that's selfish and bratty and all that, but childlikeness in there. Because where else? I toured Storm Lake, Iowa. I didn't see anybody wearing a goofy hat or mouse ears or
Maybe Jerry.
Maybe Jerry. But you see that all the time at Disneyland and Magic Kingdom. You see CEOs and doctors and lawyers. Yes, that's and there's always something special. And you're being treated like a VIP, as if you are the most important person in the entire world. And so even if you're in a bad mood, or your stomach is a little grumbly or whatever, as soon as you step foot on stage, I know the word magic is overused. It really is a magical experience, and you get caught up in that feeling as well. One of the top Imagineer, Marty Sklar, once said that if you're having trouble with how the Disney business is being operated, or you're having trouble with your superior or whatever, he says, go grab a kid or rent a kid and go back into the park, and within the first 10 minutes you see why we do what we do. And that's one of the reasons that Disney has survived and thrived and will continue to do so. Even though the Disney business sometimes makes decisions that we may have some concerns about, we may have some questions about, the core of Disney will always be there. And the interesting thing is to go backstage and how it's all completely different. It's not themed. You hear people using language that they would never use on stage, telling stories they would never tell on stage. And again, that's done on purpose, so there's a very clear distinction between on stage and backstage. But at every on-stage entrance, where you're coming from backstage on stage, there is a full-length mirror, so you can check yourself to see if you're show ready before you go on. And backstage, there's no Disney music and all that. So when you're on stage and you start to hear Disney music, you know immediately. Your whole body reacts differently.
You said that once upon a time at least, Jiminy Cricket was your favorite.
Yes.
Who is your favorite character now?
My favorite character now is the original Mickey Mouse, the Mickey Mouse that appeared in the black and white cartoons and the cartoons of the 1930s, because that was the closest to Walt Disney himself. Walt did the voice. Walt came up with the stories. Walt was the one who also decided, yes, Mickey's doing that, Mickey's not doing that. Lillian Disney, his wife, after Walt passed away, said, I just cannot look at those cartoons because they remind me so much of Walt. Frank Thomas, who was one of the 9 old men, said Walt was Mickey and Mickey was Walt. And he said the moment that Walt stopped doing Mickey's voice, Mickey was never quite the same again. And so it's that original mouse. And it's also because Mickey is full of mischief. He's full of adventure. He's loyal to his friends. And he's not the smartest mouse in the world, but boy, he's persistent and he tries. And it shows that if you have a good heart and you help others, good things will come. And I think that's as true today as it was in the 1930s.
Do we see those characteristics between Walt and Mickey? Do they kind of go together?
Absolutely.
They remind me of each other.
Absolutely. And in fact, in the Disney parks, they have the partner statue where they have Blaine Gibson, who is a sculptor who sculpted Mr. Lincoln for the World's Fair and all of the presidents for the Hall of Presidents and the pirates. And one of the funny thing about the pirates is Blaine's wife would always drag him to church, and he didn't want to because he had this work to do. So he would sit there in the pews and he would sketch the people in the pews, and so he made them pirates. So all those people who are pillaging the village and chasing these women, these are good church-going people. Blaine did a lot of sculpture, did the sculpture for Walt. He actually did a bust of Walt in 1962 for Walt and took it into Walt's office, and Walt said, "What am I going to do with that? Statues are for dead people." And Blaine was just heartbroken because he had put in so much work, and he just took it back, tossed it in his garage, and then decades later they said, "We need you to make a statue of Walt," and he pulled out this bust that he had made while Walt was alive and used that as the reference. And so there's Walt there, and he's holding Mickey's hand, and he's pointing, and he's saying, "Mickey, look at what we've accomplished together. Look at all those great things."
And he did two. Those were the two, right? There were two statues.
In Walt Disney World, yes. And that doesn't happen in any other Disney park. The Magic Kingdom, you have the partner statue, and then in Town Square, you have a statue sculpted by Blaine called Sharing the Magic. And so Roy Disney is sitting there with his leg crossed, and he's holding Minnie's hand, but he's holding her hand underneath because he's supporting Minnie just as he always supported Walt's dream. Walt unfortunately passed away in 1966, December 15th, 1966, cancer, because he was a very heavy smoker. And so the Walt Disney Company was going to sell the Disney property. Walt had purchased 30,000 acres. Who could make this dream come true in a swampland except Walt Disney? And his brother Roy was 73 years old at the time. He came out of retirement and he said, "We're going to make this happen." And it was to be called Disney World to match Disneyland. And the very first thing Roy did is he says, "We're going to call it Walt Disney World so that people remember my brother." And so he worked away, and when he was 78 years old in 1971, 40 years ago, October 1971, Magic Kingdom opened. And Roy was up there for the dedication, but he was very, very shy. And so he said, "Where's Mickey Mouse? Let's get Mickey Mouse up here. That's the closest we have to Walt." And so he stood up there with Mickey Mouse next to him doing the dedication. And the reporters said, "Well, Mr. Disney, you're 78 years old. You should be spending time with, your grandchildren and all of this."
Family.
Yes, and my gosh, this was swampland out here, and there were alligators, and and alligators can run up to 40 miles per hour, but you only have to run faster than the person you're with.
Right.
So Roy said, they said, "Why did you do this, Mr. Disney?" And Roy said, "I didn't want to have to explain to Walt when I saw him again why the dream didn't come true." And then later that day, Roy was out on a boat on the Seven Seas Lagoon, which is right in front of the Magic Kingdom. And the boat driver turned to him and said, "But Mr. Disney, shouldn't you be in the park? There's radio and TV and the newspaper interviewers and all that." And Roy said, "This is my brother's day. I want them to remember my brother today." And that was October 1971. Unfortunately, December 1971, Roy passed away. Cerebral hemorrhage. It could have been brought on by the stress. We never know, but that was always the assumption. A great loss for the company. He stayed out of the limelight, but he was the one who really helped make the dream come true. He said his job was, "Walt dreams up the castles. I'm the one who gets them built."
Gosh, we could go on forever with all these stories.
We could.
We really could. I love hearing about all of them and even the stories in the book, and there are so many more.
So
Just
you would recommend all those people who are watching this that they should go to Amazon and buy the book because it's at a discounted price now, and they should recommend that their friends read the book.
Right, and there's going to be a sequel coming out with zombies, maybe?
Yes.
No, that's how we start those rumors.
Well, you don't want to start the rumors. Son of Vault of Walt. I will tell you the sequel will have over 40,000 words on the making of Song of the South.
So there is a sequel coming.
There is a sequel coming out, yes.
Well, thank you, Jim, for coming to Buena Vista University and telling us about these great stories in Walt Disney. And there are still more amazing stories to be told. So make sure you pick up Jim's book, The Vault of Walt, where you can learn even more stories behind the stories.
But that's another story.